Good morning. My name is Steve Lawyer. I'm a professor of psychology at Idaho State University, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Erin Rasmussen received her PhD in experimental psychology from Auburn University under the direction of Dr. Chris Newland. She is currently a professor of psychology at Idaho State University, where she has a team of doctoral students from both experimental psychology and clinical psychology programs that conduct translational research in the area of obesity. She has two laboratories, one animal and one human lab, that are dedicated to examining behavioral economic, behavioral pharmacological, and neurocorrelates of behaviors involved in obesity. Her animal work examines the extent to which dopaminergic and endocannabinoid neurotransmitter systems affect the value of food reinforcement in diet-induced and genetic rodent models of obesity. Her human work examines behavioral processes, especially delay discounting and demand for food in obese populations. She recently was awarded a 3-year research grant from NIH to investigate the relations among food insecurity, diet, obesity, and food impulsivity in humans. She also collaborates on a grant with researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health in the Czech Republic. Her research has been published in journals such as Health Psychology, Behavioral Processes, Appetite, Psychopharmacology, Behavioral Pharmacology, Experimental Clinical Psychopharmacology, and other prestigious journals. Erin is also associate editor of the Behavior Analyst and has also served on the ABA International Science Board. The title of her talk today is Domain Effects, Obesity, and Delay Discounting. And as Chris mentioned, following the talk, please join us for a panel discussion about this subject matter. So please help me welcome Dr. Erin Rasmussen.
Thanks, Steve. I added Steve as a co-author for this talk because he and I have had a lot of discussions about domain effects, and he also allowed me to lift a couple of his really cool slides. So first I'll provide an overview of my talk today, talking first about what impulsive choice is and delay discounting as a fundamental behavioral process. That's the sort of tutorial part. And then I'll talk in more detail about what domain effects are in discounting, which is essentially differences in discounting among outcomes. I think the term domain effect is more of an umbrella term that can encapsulate things like commodity-specific discounting effects and maybe property-based differences in discounting, but we'll be talking mostly about commodity-specific discounting today. And commodity-specific discounting in special populations, meaning people who find specific outcomes especially reinforcing. We'll also talk about obesity and commodity-specific effects that we've observed in obese populations, and also in treatments that we've been using to change discounting. And then I'll summarize and talk about potential future directions. So impulsivity is one of these terms in psychology that I think is very nebulous and defined differently depending on who you ask, what framework you're talking about, those sorts of things. And I think one of the common threads among all of those definitions is that it's a tendency to behave without thinking, a definition that I think most behavior analysts would be uncomfortable with using. So I like to think about discounting in a slightly different way as an insensitivity to certain kinds of stimuli. Probably 3 types of stimuli, but maybe even more than that, but the ones that really ring true for me tend to be these 3. So first of all, a risk to stimuli that predict negative outcomes or perhaps aversive outcomes. So here's a person jumping off the Perrine Bridge in a town called Twin Falls, which is 2 hours from where I live. It's a beautiful bridge and a beautiful place to base jump if that's the kind of person you are. But one of the things that comes to mind when you're looking over this bridge is that there is a tremendous risk for injury or death. Probably death is more likely. And people have died jumping off of this bridge. So those stimuli that tend to, I think for the most part, send the signal of not jumping off the bridge to most of us. Some people are insensitive to those sorts of stimuli, and even in some ways very sensitive to the reinforcing properties of those sorts of stimuli. Those individual difference variables count, I think. So when we talk about insensitivity to negative outcomes, we might be talking about the mechanism of risk-taking or risky behavior. Another facet of impulsivity is an insensitivity to cues that tell us to stop. So again, aversives. But this might be more of an approach avoidance situation. Say a child might be in a store where there are lots of things that are beautiful but breakable, and mom or dad says, don't touch that beautiful glass bell, even though it's sparkly and shiny. And so if a child, decides to go to touch that or even break it, that would be an insensitivity to stop signal. And so sometimes we call these kinds of stimuli, the kind of behavior is difficulties with response inhibition. So that's another part of impulsivity that tends to be related to these other types of impulsivities, but different. And then the one that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today is delay discounting, which is an insensitivity to delayed outcomes. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into that one. Now, we know from decades of research that delays to consequences, whether they're reinforcers or punishers, tend to weaken their effects on behavior. And we know that we tend to value rewards or outcomes or reinforcers. I'm using those words interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable, of course. For a reinforcer to be a reinforcer, we have to show a functional relation. But we know that with regard to lots of these types of things, if we have to wait for them, they lose their value. And we know that there are people who are especially sensitive to delayed outcomes. That is, there are individual differences to these sorts of things. So delay discounting, probably the best definition of it is a tendency to choose smaller, sooner outcomes over larger, delayed outcomes. So people who are discounters, who are steep discounters, we'll call it, and I'll define what I mean by steep here in just a minute, are people who are characterized as impulsive, people who tend to choose those smaller, sooner over larger, later outcomes. So discounting has been called a fundamental behavioral process or a fundamental behavioral phenomenon. And there's good reasons for that. First of all, we've seen it across species. So this is something that we've seen in different types of monkeys, in chimpanzees, in humans, so even higher primates, right? Both children and adults and adolescents for that matter. We all know the marshmallow video, probably most of us have seen that one. And also, of course, rats and pigeons, and a number of other species as well. So because we've seen it across species, that tells us that there's something important there when we see the tendency to choose smaller, sooner over larger, later outcomes across species. We think that's a fundamental behavioral process. But it also underlies a number of diseases and disorders that are preventable. So it's often been called a trans-disease process as well. So we see it, for example, in substance abusing populations. We see it with smokers. They're especially sensitive to delayed outcomes, insensitive to delayed outcomes. We see this in heavy drinkers. We see it in gambling, which might be considered a disorder as opposed to a disease when it's done in a way that interferes with normal functioning. And of course, obesity and also sexual risk-taking. So we also, as a function of seeing it in these different diseases and disorders, we can also note that we see discounting across different commodities or outcomes, and reinforcers as well. So money in humans is probably the best well-researched and best understood of these because it's the most frequently used outcome in delayed discounting. We also see it though in alcohol and cigarettes, food, erotica, and sexual outcomes as well. So how do we measure discounting? So let's talk a little bit about that. That's the tutorial part, right? There are many ways to measure discounting, but the basic paradigm is to pose a series of choices between a smaller, sooner versus a larger, later outcome. And with animals, we typically use real outcomes. Food's the most frequently used. And with humans, we tend to use hypothetical outcomes. And typically money, like I said earlier, is the most frequently used outcome. So a person who does delay discounting for a human that does delay discounting might come into a laboratory and they might be presented with a series of choices on a computer screen. So for example, would you rather have $1 now, which is the smaller sooner in this case is represented in the left column, or $10 in 1 day? That might be the first question that they're asked. And they would be asked this, by the way, without seeing these other options. So just these two boxes would be presented. And so a person might say, well, I'll wait for the $10 in 1 day. They're choosing the larger later outcome in that case. Very self-controlled. Actually, not very, but we'll get to that later. So after that, subsequent choices are presented, but we manipulate the amount of the smaller sooner outcome. So on the next question, it might be $2 now versus $10 in 1 day. And so a person might continue choosing the larger later outcome as we keep increasing the smaller sooner. But at some point, that smaller sooner is going to have more value than the $10 in 1 day, and they'll choose the smaller sooner. That's the point where there's a preference reversal. So now $9 right now is the preferred outcome. And what we do is we come up with an indifference point such that we find the point that bookends the two choices, where the bookend the preference reversal. So $8 now on the last trial and $9 now is where we saw that preference reversal. So we would say there's a point between those two values where there's indifference, where these two choices are equally preferred. And so $8.50 would be that indifference point, the median. And so we would continue this process with larger delays. So $1 now versus $10 in 1 month. So this time when we increase the smaller sooner amount, we might see preference reversal at a smaller dollar value. And that indifference point would be, say, $2.50 for this individual. And we keep doing this with different delays, very large delays, until we're finished with the delays, essentially. This person would choose $1 now versus $10 in a year. And so they're choosing the smaller sooner right off the bat. So when we take those indifference points from each of those delays and we plot them against the delay, so these 3 data points are the indifference points that I just showed you, but they're plotted against the delay to the larger later outcome. What you get is the delay discounting curve, right? So as delay increases, the indifference point, the value of $10 decreases. And the rate of decay is actually a really important feature of delay discounting. So here are 2 delay discounting curves, very similar to the ones I just showed you, but one of them represents a person's behavior that is more impulsive or more sensitive to delay. That's the person in red. So you can see that there. Oops, I didn't turn this on. So this person's curve is much steeper than the less impulsive K value, or the less impulsive person. I haven't talked about K yet. K is a free parameter of the hyperbolic decay equation, which describes basically the shape of this relation between the current value of something or the subjective value of something as a function of its delay. So essentially the value is equivalent to the amount, but the delay to that amount will reduce the value. And also this free parameter K, I'm just describing this really briefly for you. So this free parameter K represents the steepness of the slope, or how, it's really an individual difference variable. I think a lot of people talk about it like that. So a person who has a very high K value means that this slope is steep, and a person who has a lower K value means that this slope is not so steep. So we can talk about K as a measure of sensitivity to delay, but also we could talk about it even more in the vernacular as someone who's more impulsive. So higher Ks mean more impulsive. So K is one of the dependent variables that we use in discounting, and then area under the curve is another one. So this is just more a theoretical measure. It doesn't assume anything about the shape of the curve, but it allows us to have a normal distribution of values because K is often non-normally distributed. So here, what we do is we fit trapezoids to a curve kind of like this, and we sum the value of those trapezoids together to give us a value between 0 and 1. 0 in this case means that the slope is steeper, therefore the value of the area under the curve should be lower. So lower area under the curve values mean more impulsive behavior. In other words, AUC is inversely related to K values. You can probably imagine too, if you did this with the black curve, that there'd be a higher value, higher area under the curve. So higher values mean more self-controlled behavior, which is the opposite of impulsivity. At least for this talk it is. Okay, so one of the questions that I think has been discussed in discounting research is what is discounting? What exactly is it? It's a behavioral pattern, but can we call it a trait, or is it something that is contextual and state-like? And I think there is evidence to support both of these answers as yes. But Odom in 2011 did something really interesting where she looked at area under the curve values, so measures of discounting, across different commodities and compared them. So if you look here, where you have, these are 4 figures that have, on the x-axis, area under the curve values for money, so between 0 and 1. And then on the y-axis, there is area under the curve values for 4 different commodities, actually 3 different commodities. So cigarettes on the top. Is this working? There it is. Heroin here, and then $100 worth of food here, and $10 worth of food here. And what she found was that there was a positive relation between area under the curve values for money and area under the curve values for different commodities, for cigarettes, heroin, and food. And what that suggests, of course, is that people who are steep discounters for money tend to also be steep discounters for other commodities. And this supports the notion that discounting is a trait. You see it across different contexts. It's a general behavioral pattern. She also looked at test-retest reliability with discounting and found that there were positive relations there, very strong correlations. So that, again, supports that discounting is trait-like, it's stable. But we also have to point out that all of the curves don't fall on the line, and the line is not equivalent to 1. The slope is not equivalent to 1, which suggests that there's not a one-to-one relation between discounting for one commodity and another, right? So in other words, if your discounting value is 0.8 for money, it's not necessarily going to be 0.8 for some other commodity. There's some noise and variation in these values, which we would predict anyway. So people are complex, as it turns out. So one of the things I want to talk about is something that might contribute to that variability. And so despite the fact that people tend to be steep discounters in one context and another, there still is a tendency for one commodity to be more steeply discounted than another. And one of the things that might account for this is something called domain effect. And the domain effect, like I mentioned earlier, is just this observation that some outcomes tend to be discounted more steeply than others. And probably the best characterized domain effect in discounting right now is the one that shows that food is more steeply discounted than money. So that's been shown a number of times. I'll show you some data here from Essel and colleagues, which compares discounting curves for money, which is here. Here's money right here in the open squares. And then discounting for beer, candy, and soda, all of which have caloric value and are characterized as food. Yes, beer is food. So essentially, what they found in this study is that all 3 of the food-related items, so beer, candy, and soda, were discounted very similarly, and all of them more steeply than money. So, and I should also mention that these, the value of all of these were equated, so that they could be directly compared, which I think is an important feature. So, other studies have shown this as well. It's been replicated a number of times. But one of the questions, got ahead of myself, one of the questions about this domain effect is, well, why do we see these differences with food discounting? And right off the bat, I'm sure some of you noticed that food is a primary reinforcer and money is a conditioned reinforcer or secondary reinforcer, meaning that it gets its value through being through its pairing or association with primary reinforcement. So that's one possibility. And then another possibility is that food is immediately or directly consumable, whereas money is not. You have to exchange it, you have to go somewhere and exchange it to get something that is consumable, for example. So that is another feature about food versus money that might contribute to this domain effect. Another part, another property of food is the nature of it being metabolic. So Charlton and Fantino conducted a study where they looked at not only the directly consumable nature of outcomes, but also whether or not it has metabolic function. So they compared money, which is not directly consumable and does not have metabolic function, with music, DVDs, and books, which are all directly consumable, but without metabolic function. And then food, which is metabolic and directly consumable. And they found something very interesting. First, they replicated the domain effect, which of course is important. So here's money in the dashed line right here. It's the least steeply discounted of all the commodities. Then they found that music, DVDs, and books were discounted more steeply than money. So directly consumable is probably the piece there. But food was really the most steeply discounted again. So that pulls food away from the other commodities in the sense that it has a metabolic function, but still directly consumable. So metabolic function probably plays a role in this as well. And then another property of food that is, I think, directly important is its non-fungible nature. So fungibility refers to the degree to which a commodity can be exchanged for a variety of goods. So the more fungible something is, the more exchangeable. And so Holt, in a recent study, published some data that compared a number of different types of outcomes that were fungible versus non-fungible. So the fungible ones are over here on the left. So we have a Visa gift card, highly fungible, cash, very fungible, and then grocery cards and clothing gift cards. So somewhat fungible, you can buy a variety of things within a certain category, but not, not as fungible, say, as, or not as fungible as Visa gift cards and cash. And then on the non-fungible side, we have very specific objects like jeans and pizza slices and candy. And then also a pizza gift card, which is a little less fungible than, say, a clothing gift card, or I would say a grocery gift card. So at any rate, what they found is when you look at the area of the curve values of these types of outcomes, you see that the non-fungible items have lower area under the curve values compared to the more fungible items, suggesting that the more non-fungible something is, the more steeply it's discounted. I'll also point out that they replicated a magnitude effect here, where smaller amount items that are in the hashed bars have lower discounting rates compared to, or lower AUC values. So more impulsivity for those types of things compared to larger amounts. So that's a replication of magnitude effect, which is something that has been shown in discounting as well. So, but the take-home message here is that the more non-fungible something is, the lower those area under the curve values are going to be, and food is less fungible than money. So, really quickly, I'll summarize food as a domain-specific outcome. I mentioned earlier that money is the most frequently used outcome in discounting research, which I think is a very important point. That there's a good reason why money, by the way, there's lots of good reasons actually why money is used frequently in discounting research. And I think we'll talk more about those reasons after this talk. But when you look at the data with food discounting, and outcomes such as food, when you see that they're more steeply discounted than money, I think it should raise some pause about why are we not using these types of outcomes more frequently in our research. We know that food is a primary reinforcer. We know that it's more immediately consumable. We know that it has metabolic function, and we know that it's less fungible than money, which might contribute to why it's discounted more steeply. So we use monetary outcomes by default often when we do discounting research. Everybody does money. with discounting, so I'm going to go ahead and use money too. But when we do that, we have to ask ourselves a few questions about our choices for this. One has to do with the ecological validity of money. I mean, certainly money is something that everybody finds, most people, I would say, I guess 99.9% of the population, I would guess, finds reinforcing. But often when we're looking at health-related research questions in delay discounting, we are using money as the outcome. And one of the questions that is raised is, how ecologically valid is this? If we're looking at, for example, substance abuse, and we're looking at money as the outcome, might it be more ecologically valid to use drug as the outcome as opposed to money? And certainly people have done this, by the way, but money is typically the one that you see. So we have to ask ourselves about ecological validity in the sense that are we modeling sensitivity to the right kinds of outcomes that are relevant to the health problem? And then also predictive validity. If we see domain-specific discounting in different populations that have these tendencies to value certain kinds of outcomes more than others, we might be better off using those kinds of outcomes for our measurement. And so one of the questions we're going to tackle next is, do we see domain-specific discounting in special populations? And then clinical validity. So we're seeing more and more studies coming out now that try to change discounting. So treatment in the sense that we're trying to change discounting, and especially in populations where they have impulsivity problems. So would it be important to look at these kinds of different outcomes other than money in these special populations, especially if we're trying to evaluate treatment effects for those special populations? So I'm going to try to answer some of these questions, at least rudimentarily, for the remainder of the talk. So the first question is, do we see domain effects in special populations? In other words, do some populations discount some outcomes more steeply than others? And here's the important part. Do those outcomes relate to the health problem that's relevant? So I think no ABA experience would be complete without seeing at least one citation of the Madden 97 paper. Some of you have already seen it already as well. But this paper, I think, is a great example of discounting using different types of outcomes. So in this paper, discounting for money was compared in an opioid-dependent population versus a non-drug using population. And so that's this figure right here, this top one. So this is money, discounting for money, and here are the individuals who are non-drug users, and here are the individuals who are opioid dependent. And so right off the bat, you can see that opioid dependent individuals more steeply discount money. And so that's important, right? They're more impulsive for money compared to individuals who are non-drug users. But when you take those opioid dependent drug users and you look at only their behavior and you compare discounting for money versus heroin, which is this curve down here. So here's money, and here's heroin. Heroin's really steeply discounted. So there's a domain effect there. So to just recapitulate this, so steeper rates of discounting are observed in opioid-dependent individuals for money compared to controls. And then you see a domain effect where heroin users discount heroin more steeply than money. And by the way, this has been shown with a number of other drug-using / abusing populations. So with cocaine, people who are dependent on cocaine, I'm not sure if it was dependent or chronic users, but regardless, people who use cocaine often discount money more steeply than non-cocaine users, but also they discount cocaine more steeply than money. So that's been shown with that population. The same thing with alcohol. Heavy drinkers discount money more steeply than non-drinkers, but discount alcohol more steeply than money. And cigarettes, also the same. So cigarette users discount money more steeply than non-smokers, and ex-smokers for that matter, but discount cigarettes more steeply than money. So that's very consistent. Here's another population that's of interest. We've covered drugs. Now what about sex? So this is a population of individuals who are not necessarily problematic in the sense that they have health problems. Some people would argue that they are, but we're not going to answer that question today. People who like to look at porn, erotica. Who doesn't like to look at erotica, right? Well, there are some people that don't like to look at erotica, as it turns out. So this study was done by a lawyer, and what he did was he compared discounting for money in people who enjoy looking at erotica versus people who don't enjoy looking at erotica. And it's hard to see this, but the erotica users have very steep discounting curves for money, and the non-erotica users have less steep discounting curves for money. So differences in money. But what about, are there domain effects? Well, in a different study that came a little bit later, so now we're not talking about erotica users, we're talking about people who are, the outcome is sexual outcome, and the way that we describe the sexual outcome is imagine your best ideal sexual experience, and then how many minutes of that is the outcome, right? That's the thing you're discounting. And so bear with me with this for just a minute, because this is a little bit difficult to describe because discounting curves are not present. But what Lawyer and Shefflin did in this study is that they had people complete a couple of different scales, so self-report measures that got at how sexually excitable they were. So sexual excitation, which is in red, or is that black? That's black, okay. And then people who were sexually inhibited. They completed another scale on sexual inhibition, so how inhibited you feel with sex. And then they had them complete discounting tasks for money and discounting tasks for your ideal sexual outcome. And what they found with using regression is, so beta weight is on the y-axis here. And so that's basically how strong the relation is between sexual excitation and sexual inhibition and money and sexual discounting. And what they found was for money discounting, sexual excitation and sexual inhibition didn't really predict much in terms of discounting. Money discounting just wasn't all that relevant to sexual excitation and sexual inhibition. But sexual excitation was positively and strongly and significantly related to sexual discounting, and positively, there was a positive association there. And sexual inhibition was negatively, so this bar that's less than 0, was negatively predictive. So the more inhibited someone was, the less steeply they discounted for sexual outcomes. And so the fact that, or the observation rather, that we have significant predictions for sexual outcomes and not for money outcomes suggests that there is potential domain effect there. And then we'll get to, of course, beer lovers. So these, again, beer lovers this is not a population that is currently at risk for health problems. It's just people who love beer, right? So are there domain effects for beer lovers? So back in 2010, Tsukiyama and Duckworth published a paper that, first of all, replicated the domain effect with money and food. They showed that food was more steeply discounted than money. But they did something a little extra. They looked at, they had people rate how much they enjoyed, or how tempting they found certain kinds of outcomes. Candy, chips, and beer, all of these are foods that I'm going to show you. And then they looked at discounting rates for these types of foods, and what they saw is that as the temptation rating from 1 through 5, as it went up, so 5 is very tempting, as that increased, discounting values, K-values increased for chips, candy, and beer, and they were not significantly different. They just all increased as a function of temptation rating. But then they took beer lovers and candy lovers, so people who rated beer highly, a 5, and people who rated candy highly, also a 5. And they compared them in terms of discounting rates for candy and beer. So beer lovers are in blue. They had the higher discounting rates compared to the candy lovers. That's interesting. But when you look at how much they discounted for beer, beer lovers discounted beer more steeply than they discounted beer lovers discounted more steeply than candy lovers for beer. So that's a potential domain effect as well. So beer lovers tend to discount beer more steeply. So, to summarize this section, with people who have extensive experiences with a specific commodity or find an outcome preferred or either through self-report or through a more objective measure of having a chronic health problem with it, we see the strongest discounting for that commodity. So I think that alone suggests that it may make some sense to measure discounting with that kind of specific commodity that's relevant to the health problem, either in addition to money or instead of money. It has ecological utility and there's clinical utility in doing that. So what I want to do now is talk about domain effects. We talked about food as a domain effect, meaning that food is discounted more steeply than money. And we've even seen some somewhat domain effects with beer drinkers. So what about to what extent this translates into a health problem? So obesity would be a health problem that's related to food being especially preferred or subjectively valued or highly reinforcing. And of course, you can find food very preferred or subjectively valuable without eating too much of it. So I want to point that out, that just because something is subjectively valued, someone rates it highly, does not mean that a person is at risk for developing a problem with it. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be a very strong reinforcer, in other words. And so I do want to mention that, but here is a population where food does become so reinforcing that it can result in potential health problems. So first of all, we have to ask the question, have we seen, is impulsivity and delayed discounting specifically related to obesity? And the answer, the more evidence we see in the research that's published, the more we tend to see that that is supported. So there's even a meta-analysis that was published not long ago that pooled a bunch of studies to show that monetary discounting and obesity are related. Probably the first study that showed this was Weller's study, which showed discounting curves between obese women, right here, and control women for $50,000. So if this is monetary discounting, very high magnitude discounting. And they replicated that with women, obese women over here, with $1,000. So two different magnitudes of money, they see that effect. They didn't see it in men, but they saw it with women. And that's been replicated with some other studies as well. So our lab has been, in the last few years, examining not only monetary discounting, but also food discounting. We've been trying to model types of food discounting that might occur in a single meal. So we look at things like bites of food. How many bites of food would you eat now versus later? And what we have people do is we have them come into a laboratory and we give them a little cube, and it's basically a dice, or a die, I should say. And we ask them to imagine that it's a bite of their favorite food. And we ask them questions about, would you rather have X number of bites now or Y number of bites later? And the later is usually on the order of hours that seems to produce the best fits. And what we get is discounting curves that look very similar to money discounting curves in the sense that you get that hyperbolic decay. But one study in particular, we had people come in who were obese, who had a high percent body fat, and compared them to individuals who have low percent body fat. And what we found is area under the curve values, so if you look here first, so this is for food discounting. What we found was that individuals who have high percent body fat had significantly lower area under the curve values compared to those with low percent body fat, suggesting they were more impulsive for food. We didn't see a significant difference with money, which is next to that right here. I do want to point out, though, that the money that we used was a very low magnitude. $10 was the highest value that we used. So it might have something to do with the magnitude of money. But we did see these significant differences with food, suggesting a potential domain effect. We replicated this study with adolescents and a community sample of adults with a different measure of discounting. So the first study was with the adjusting amount procedure, computerized adjusting amount procedure. And then this study was conducted with a Kirby-style food choice questionnaire, which we validated and replicated a couple of years ago. But in this study, we had adolescents make choices for smaller sooner versus larger later bites of food. The magnitude was bigger than 10 bites. With this study, it ranged, we had a small magnitude, medium magnitude, and large magnitude on this measure, and across all measures there were, across all magnitudes there were differences. But what we saw was that adolescents who had high percent body fat, so those in the gray bar, had higher K values than those with a lower percent body fat for food discounting. And adults, we replicated that. Again, the K values were higher for food discounting compared to the low percent body fat. When we used the traditional Kirby money choice questionnaire, over here, we didn't get differences in money with the adolescents that were related to percent body fat. We did get a money effect with the adults though, so that's, some mixed results with the domain effect, but interestingly enough, food discounting seems to always be predicted by high percent body fat, at least with these studies. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about treatment. So a treatment that we've been using with our participants, or human participants. So I'm not going to talk about, give you any animal data today. This is all human stuff today. I forgot to mention that earlier. But what I want to talk about today is something we've been doing in the lab. As someone who's trained as an animal person, I've really been stretched by my students the last 2 years. I'm doing something called mindful eating in my laboratory. And I know there's, what? But let me explain before tomatoes are thrown at me. Mindfulness, as many of you know, has become a standard term that's been interpreted for different therapies in clinical psychology as part of treatments and as treatments for chronic pain and depression and anxiety. And it's empirically supported, as it turns out, to a point where NIH no longer considers it a complementary alternative treatment. In fact, I got a grant for doing some mindful eating from them recently, so I was kind of shocked by that. But at any rate, mindful eating, the way we use it at least, what we try to do is we try to apply it to eating. And anybody who's ever done the raisin exercise knows what mindful eating is. And here's basically how we define mindful eating. It's a strategy or a training that can be applied to the experience of eating. I have 5 minutes left. Okay. So essentially, we define mindful eating as verbal behavior in which we tact the experience of eating. That's very, very behavioral. So it goes like something like this. We give a person a strawberry, and we ask them to make statements about the strawberry that are objective and that describe their experience of eating the strawberry. So they might start out by saying, the strawberry is red, it has a pattern of seeds. I've never noticed it before. There's a pattern of seeds that's very systematic. It has 4 green leaves on top. We ask them to smell it. They tell us what it smells like. They write their observations down, so we know that they're doing this. And we have them take a bite. They describe the flavor they're experiencing, how it feels in their mouth, the textures, how their body responds to it, if they're salivating more, how they feel after they've swallowed the strawberry. It's a very long, deliberate process. So when we do mindful eating, we have people eat 4 bites of food, and we do it in a way that it takes them 10 minutes to eat each piece of food. So it's long. And what we're trying to do is really get them to write down and really focus on the tacting of the eating experience. So our first study that looked at mindful eating used 102 undergraduates, and we assigned them to one of 2 conditions: a mindful eating condition in which they were given the 4 pieces of food and taken through a process where they, learned to tact the eating of those 4 pieces of food. 50 minutes of training, essentially. And then we assigned the other half of participants to a nutritional education DVD video, where they ate the same 4 pieces of food that the mindful eating group ate, but they weren't instructed on how to eat it. They could eat them however they liked. And then they watched a video on the food pyramid. So food cues they got, exposure to food cues and all sorts of things. 15-minute condition. And then what we did is we had them complete delayed discounting tasks for food and delayed discounting tasks for money at baseline, and then again after the treatment. And we were interested to see if their discounting changed after their treatments. And what we found was this is the control group for food discounting. And what you can see here, there's a curve for pre and a curve for post. And what you see is that there's no difference between those two curves for the control DVD condition. They got the folks who ate the 4 bites of food, or 4 pieces of food, and saw the DVD condition. For the mindful eating, the pre-test is here and the post-test is here. And so the post-test, what you see is a less steep discounting curve, meaning that they're less impulsive after they do the mindful eating. And just to show you also that we saw a domain effect, potential domain effect at least, in the top graph, so these are area under the curve values for food discounting. So here's your control group. This is the pre-test and the post-discounting. So no difference in the control group. And then mindful eating, here is the impulsivity for, or area under the curve or delay discounting for mindful eating, and then it goes up after the mindful eating treatment. So meaning that they're less impulsive. Here's the money condition, so no differences in money discounting before or after. So that could be interpreted as a domain effect. We replicated this with adolescents recently. We did it a little differently. We used a different measure of discounting, the food choice questionnaire, so the Kirby style discounting, which seems to work really well with adolescents. Just as an FYI, anybody's looking for a food discounting measure for teenagers, this works great. Actually, it works for adults too, but teens as well. So we added a second group, a control group that received no treatment at all, just the 4 bites of food, just to see if there was some sort of stabilizing effect of the DVD condition. But here we have K-value on the y-axis, and here's the control group that got nothing but the 4 pieces of food. The DVD control group that got the DVD control with the 4 pieces of food, and then the mindful eating group, and their K-values significantly decrease for food discounting. When you look at money discounting, there are no differences among all 3 groups. So that could be, again, potential domain effect. Okay, so to wrap things up, a few points and take-home messages. Individuals who value specific outcomes, whether they say it subjectively through self-reports or who perhaps have excessive experiences with specific outcomes, seem to have the steepest discounting for those outcomes. And we've seen that in drug using populations, we've seen it in erotica appreciating populations, and beer drinkers for that matter, compared to control samples. And also those individuals who have those experiences with those outcomes have steeper discounting for those outcomes compared to money. In other words, there are domain effects. There are different patterns of discounting across commodities. There's domain effects, in other words, those that are directly consumable and metabolic and perishable. I didn't talk about perishability. That's also a feature of the domain effect with food. And things that are non-fungible tend to be discounted most steeply. Food is one of these outcomes, and some of the other outcomes we talked about, drugs, for example, have some properties of this as well. We've observed and replicated stronger food-specific discounting in obese individuals compared to healthy weight individuals, and mindful eating tends to predict domain-specific changes in discounting related to food. And we have a project underway right now that's looking at domain effects with food insecure individuals, people who are worried about when their next meal is coming from. We expect that we'll see strong food, we would guess at least, that we would see strong food discounting in this population, but we'll see. We're testing both money and food discounting with these individuals. So I think if I were to pull out the point I want to make here, I'm hoping maybe you're seeing it, is that if we assess discounting for outcomes other than money, things that especially are relevant to the health problem that we're trying to understand and study, that might have some utility. So There's ecological validity here and clinical utility in the idea that specific outcomes that are more relevant to the health problem get us closer to the behavior, actually assessing the behavior that's relevant to the health problem. And then treatment. Some interventions may actually be more sensitive to changes in those specific outcomes compared to money. So if you're using money, great, but consider using other outcomes as well, especially if you're looking at a specific population of individuals, is I guess, my big take-home message here. We still have a lot of holes to fill. There's, with the small amount of research we've done with food discounting, I think it lends itself to a lot of unanswered questions that need immediate attention, in my opinion. One of those has to do with intervention effects. So, like I said, we're seeing more intervention studies with discounting, which I think is great, treatment and intervention studies. But they're really in their infancy. So I would like to see more research that, where there are treatments where we're trying to change discounting, using outcomes that are more relevant to those health problems that we're trying to model. And to what extent is discounting related to reinforcer efficacy for specific outcomes? I mean, we haven't really looked at, if we see discounting with this specific commodity, have we really assessed how reinforcing that commodity is? Like, it's a subjective thing with discounting, right? It's not, you're not doing a reinforcer assessment or a test for reinforcer efficacy necessarily. So those kinds of studies would be really important. Parametric questions. We've seen domain effects with small magnitude outcomes. What about medium-sized or large magnitude outcomes? Would those domain effects disappear? That's something that we're currently investigating in our laboratory, and other people are looking at as well. And to what extent are there domain-specific outcomes in real versus hypothetical outcomes? So everybody knows who does discounting that when you compare real versus hypothetical outcomes, they're very similar in terms of the discounting curves they produce. But that's with monetary discounting. A recent study from Lawyer actually shows that with cigarette smokers, real cigarettes are discounted more steeply than hypothetical cigarettes. So that's something that, if we're going to use these other types of outcomes that are non-monetary, we need to understand, all the parametric issues that are related to those sorts of outcomes. And then working through the system, there's an issue of systematic versus non-systematic data. So one of the great things about money discounting is you get very systematic data. When you use non-monetary outcomes, you get less, your data are less systematic. You get people who respond differently. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the panel, I hope. And so we have to kind of work through what are the conditions, for example, we get people in our lab who will sometimes want the smaller amount rather than the larger amount when it comes to food. And I have some data to show for that too, but I don't know, we'll have time for that during the panel. But so what do we do with those individuals who don't value more of food? Do we not study them? Do we forget about them? Or do we understand the conditions under which that happens? And so working through those issues, I think, would be really important if we're going to use non-monetary outcomes. But I think that's a good reason to. We need more research in the area, I guess, as a take-home message. So I'd like to thank my collaborators and my grant support, and thank you all for listening to me yammer on.